The words landed so quietly that Abigail Turner needed a moment to be sure she had actually heard them. Her father sat at the kitchen table, both hands curled around a tin coffee cup, his eyes fixed on the wood grain as though it might offer him some kind of answer. Her younger sister Lillian sat close beside him, golden hair catching the soft morning light, wearing an expression that was almost too satisfied. "Lillian will not be making the journey west," her father said, his voice low and even. The sentence settled over the small Nebraska farmhouse the way dust settles after a storm has passed through. Abigail was still standing near the stove, her hands warm from stirring the morning porridge. She waited for him to continue, already sensing where the truth was headed. Lillian raised her chin with quiet pride. "I am going to marry Thomas Reed," she said, "the banker's son." Abigail looked from her sister to her parents and then back again. Her mother kept her eyes carefully averted. Her father gave a slow, deliberate clearing of his throat. "The rancher out in Wyoming has already paid for the passage," he said. "He is expecting a bride to arrive on the spring stage." The understanding moved through Abigail's chest in a cold, heavy wave. "Are you asking me to go in her place?" she said. Nobody spoke a word. That silence told her everything she needed to know. Outside, the prairie wind dragged the dry grass along the fence rails with a low, restless sound. Inside, the little kitchen seemed to have shrunk around her, until there was almost no air left to breathe. "You are strong," her father said at last. "You know how to work the land. The man made it clear he needs a wife who can handle hard country." Abigail let a quiet breath out through her nose. "I see," she said. Lillian played idly with the ribbon in her hair, already half lost in some vision of her future banker's parlor and its lace curtains. "Be sensible about this, Abby," she said in her lightest voice. "You would honestly be better suited to a life out there anyway." Sensible. Abigail turned toward the window and looked at her own reflection in the glass. Sun-darkened skin, broad shoulders, hands roughened by years of mending fences and hauling water. Nothing like the soft, delicate Lillian. Nothing like the girl in the photograph that had already been sent west to a man named Nathaniel Walker. "He is expecting her," Abigail said, her voice just above a whisper. "You will explain the situation honestly when you arrive," her father replied. "If he refuses to accept you, he will send you back home." "And if he did not refuse?" Abigail stared out across the flat, endless Nebraska prairie. Perhaps this was her one chance to step clear of the shadow she had spent her whole life standing in. "When does the stage depart?" she asked. 3 days from now," her father said, and the relief in his voice was impossible to miss. Abigail took a slow breath and gave a single, steady nod. "I will go," she said. Her mother looked up sharply, as though she had not quite expected that answer. "But I go as myself," Abigail added, turning back to face them both. "I will tell him the truth from the very moment I step off that stage. No deception, no playing a role I was never meant to play. The rancher in Wyoming would see exactly who had arrived, and then the choice would be entirely his." But as Abigail climbed the narrow staircase to pack the small number of things she owned, a single question trailed behind her like a shadow. When Nathaniel Walker looked up and realized that the wrong woman had come west to marry him, would he turn her away, or would he ask her to stay? The stagecoach rattled and shook as though it were threatening to come apart with every passing mile. Abigail Turner gripped the edge of the wooden seat, while the wheels punched through rut after rut in the road. Clouds of dust pushed in through the leather curtains and coated everything in a pale grayish film: her dress, her carpet bag, even the worn Bible that the thin preacher across from her clutched in both hands. 5 days on the road already, 5 long days carrying her farther from Nebraska and steadily closer to a man who was expecting an entirely different woman. Seated beside the preacher was a round, cheerful woman in a traveling bonnet who had wasted no time introducing herself. "Harriet Bell," she had announced brightly, "widow, out of Missouri." Now she leaned forward again with that same expression of warm, undisguised curiosity. "First time heading west, dear?" "Yes, ma'am," Abigail said. "And what takes you all this way out here?" Abigail paused. She had made a promise to herself about honesty, but laying out the whole complicated story to strangers in a jolting coach felt like more than she had energy for. "I am going to meet someone," she said simply. Harriet's eyes lit up at once. "A husband, perhaps?" Abigail gave a small, non-committal nod. The preacher lowered his Bible just enough to look at her. "The Lord sets many feet on such a path," he said with gentle sincerity. Across the coach, a pair of rough-looking miners exchanged a quiet laugh. One of them muttered something about hoping the fellow would be pleased with what he found. Abigail chose not to hear it. She turned her gaze out toward the landscape instead. The tidy, familiar farms of Nebraska had gradually disappeared behind her. In their place, the world had opened up into something vast and untamed. A sky so wide it seemed to have no edges. Endless rippling grass, lonely creeks winding through the plain, and wind bending everything in long, slow waves like a silent, moving sea. At every relay station, the horses were swapped out and the passengers climbed stiffly down to stretch their legs. Abigail always moved apart from the group, grateful for a few minutes of fresh air and quiet. At the second stop, she used a handful of coins her mother had pressed into her palm before departure to buy hard bread and dried beef. "You will need this for the road ahead," her mother had said softly. A small cloth pouch of peppermint candies had followed, slipped quietly into Abigail's coat pocket as an afterthought. Now, as the coach pushed westward again, she unwrapped one and let the cool sweetness dissolve slowly on her tongue. The taste pulled her back to childhood Christmases, to a time before the farm had grown lean and difficult, before she had come to fully understand what it meant to always be the second daughter in the house. On the third day, the landscape around them began to shift in a way she had not expected. The grass grew short and sparse. Gray-green sagebrush spread along both sides of the trail, and far ahead, hazy and blue at the edge of the sky, the first real mountains she had ever seen rose slowly into view. Harriet Bell grew noticeably quieter as the emptiness deepened around them. The preacher's prayers became more frequent. The miners began checking their revolvers with quiet regularity whenever rumors drifted down the trail about trouble on the road ahead. But Abigail just watched. The farther west they traveled, the more that strange, unnamed feeling in her chest grew. It might have been fear, or it might have been something closer to possibility. That evening she drew Nathaniel Walker's letters out of her carpet bag and read them again by the fading light. His handwriting was careful but plain, and the words matched it. "I am not a man given to fancy talk," he had written. "I work cattle and horses. The winters run long out here, and the neighbors are far apart. But the land is good, and I own it free and clear." Abigail traced that last line slowly with one finger. Between each plain, careful sentence, she could feel something else living in the spaces, something quiet and deep. Loneliness. She folded the letter with care and tucked it safely away. Tomorrow the stage would reach Cheyenne. Tomorrow she would stand in front of a man who believed her sister was the one coming west, and Abigail would hand him the truth as plainly as she could. Then she would wait and see whether that truth turned out to be enough. Cheyenne announced itself at sunset. The stagecoach crested one last dusty rise, and the town spread below them like a rough, determined promise hammered into the open prairie. Abigail Turner leaned forward in her seat, her fingers pressing into the edge of the wooden bench. For 5 days the world had been nothing but wind and dust and empty land. Now there were buildings crowded together along a wide, noisy street. Lanterns threw amber light from saloon windows. Wagons clattered past, horses stamped at hitching rails in front of the depot, and voices carried through the cooling air from every direction. Noise, movement, strangers everywhere. The coach lurched to a stop. "Cheyenne," the driver called out. The passengers began climbing down one by one, stretching aching limbs and rolling stiff shoulders. Abigail waited her turn, her heart working faster with every second. Somewhere in the crowd standing at the edge of that depot was the man who had been waiting for her sister. She stepped down from the coach and dust swirled up around her skirts as her boots touched Wyoming soil for the very first time. The evening air tasted different here, drier and sharper, carrying something of sage and far-off mountain snow. Abigail picked up her carpet bag and looked around slowly. Men in wide-brimmed hats moved in every direction. Cowboys laughed outside the nearest saloon. A cluster of merchants argued loudly over a stack of crates near the depot entrance. Too many faces, too many strangers, all at once. And then she saw him. He stood slightly apart from the others, tall and still as a fence post planted in open country. His hat was pulled low against the last of the sunlight, but she could make out his eyes clearly enough, gray, careful, and carrying something that looked very much like hope. He was scanning each face as the passengers stepped down from the coach. He was not handsome the way polished city men were handsome, but there was a solidity to the way he stood, the kind that comes from a man who has learned to hold his ground in a storm. His gaze passed over her once, and then came back a second time, slower now, with a question forming behind it. Abigail lifted her chin and walked straight toward him. No hesitating, no stalling, no pretending. "Mr. Walker," she said. The man gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was deep and unhurried. Abigail set down her carpetbag at her feet. "My name is Abigail Turner." She watched the confusion move across his face and let it settle before she continued. "My sister Lillian was the one who wrote to you. She has decided to marry someone else." The words floated between them in the cooling evening air. "My family sent me in her place." Silence followed. The noise of Cheyenne went on around them, but between the two of them, the world seemed to grow very still. Nathaniel Walker studied her with careful attention, not angry, not visibly disappointed, but with the kind of quiet, unhurried judgment a rancher gives to a horse before deciding whether it is worth his trust. "You came here alone?" he asked. "Yes." 5 days on the stage? "Yes." "And you knew I might turn you back east the moment you stepped off that coach?" Abigail held his gaze without looking away. "Yes." Another long silence stretched between them. The sun slipped lower, pulling the last of its gold behind the mountains and leaving the town in deep, quiet shadow. Then Nathaniel bent down without a word and lifted her carpetbag off the ground. "Town is no place for a woman traveling alone after dark," he said. He tilted his head toward the street. "There is a boarding house nearby." Abigail blinked. "You are not sending me away tonight?" "No." His expression gave nothing more away than that. "We will talk in the morning." Then he turned and began walking steadily down the street. After a brief pause, Abigail followed. Behind them, the stagecoach driver cracked his whip, and the horses leaned into their harness, pulling away from the depot in a low cloud of dust. And for the first time since leaving Nebraska, Abigail realized she genuinely had no idea what the morning would bring. The boarding house sat 2 streets back from the depot. It was a solidly built wooden structure with a painted sign out front that read Mrs. Caldwell's Rooms and Supper. Warm lamplight spilled from every window, and the smell of fresh bread drifted out into the evening air and wrapped itself around you the moment you stepped near the door. Nathaniel pushed it open and stepped aside for Abigail to enter first. Inside, the room was bright and warm. A handful of travelers sat around a long table working through their evening meal, while an older woman with sharp, perceptive eyes stood behind the front counter. She looked up the moment they came in. "Well now," she said pleasantly. "Mr. Walker, I did not expect to see you back in town so soon." Nathaniel set Abigail's carpetbag down beside the staircase. "Evening, Mrs. Caldwell." The woman's gaze moved immediately and with undisguised curiosity to Abigail. And who might this be? Nathaniel was quiet for just half a beat. "This is Miss Abigail Turner," he said. "She will be needing a room for the night." Mrs. Caldwell's eyebrows climbed slightly. "Oh." But she asked nothing further. Instead, she turned to Abigail with a warm, knowing smile. "Of course, dear. You look like you have been run clean through. Supper is just about ready if you would like some." Abigail nodded with genuine relief. "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Caldwell led her upstairs to a small but neat room with a real bed, a pitcher of water on the stand, and a narrow window looking out over the quiet street below. "Wash up," the woman said kindly. "Food will be waiting when you come down." When she left, and the door clicked shut, Abigail stood in the middle of the room for a moment without moving. 5 days on a stagecoach, and now a clean room and a bed that did not bounce. She washed the trail dust from her face and hands, changed into her second dress, and repinned her hair. Through the window below, she could see Nathaniel in the yard, tending to his horses with slow, deliberate care, brushing them down and checking the harness, that same unhurried steadiness she had noticed in him when he first looked at her. Shortly after, Mrs. Caldwell called the house down to supper. Abigail took a seat at the long table directly across from Nathaniel. Other travelers filled in around them, a surveyor, 2 traveling salesmen, and a school teacher bound for somewhere farther west. Conversation moved easily around the table. Nathaniel contributed very little. He ate quietly, answered when addressed, but offered nothing beyond what was asked. Abigail matched his silence without difficulty. After days of hard bread and road dust, the hot meal was more than enough. When supper was done, Nathaniel stood and gestured toward the front porch with a small nod. Walk? Outside, the Wyoming night had gone cool. They sat together on a wooden bench beneath the pale circle of a hanging lantern. Above them, the sky stretched out wide and black, scattered with stars brighter and more numerous than Abigail had ever seen in her life. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Nathaniel turned toward her slightly. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Yes." "Garden?" "Since I was a small child." "Livestock?" "Mostly dairy cows, but cattle are cattle." He studied her for another quiet moment. "Isolation does not trouble you?" "How far out is your nearest neighbor?" "About 8 miles." Abigail considered that without flinching. "I have never had any difficulty with my own company." Nathaniel took out a pipe and turned it in his hands without lighting it. "I am not an easy man to live with," he said after a moment. "I work from first light until dark. I am not someone who talks a great deal." Abigail looked at him steadily. "I did not come this far, looking for easy." That earned her the smallest, quietest flicker of surprise in his gray eyes. Then, after a pause, he asked, "What did you come looking for?" She did not have to think about the answer. "Something honest," she said. Nathaniel held her gaze in the lantern light. And for the first time that evening, the corners of his mouth came very close to a smile. Morning arrived early in Cheyenne. Abigail was awake before the sun had even begun to consider rising. Her body still running on years of farm work and habit. Pale gray light was just beginning to seep through the thin curtains, and the quiet house carried the faint smell of wood smoke and bread starting in the kitchen below. For a moment she lay still, reminding herself exactly where she was. Wyoming. A boarding house. And somewhere downstairs, the man who held her future in his hands. She dressed quickly and pinned her hair tight, the way she always did when there was work ahead. When she stepped into the hallway, the house was silent, except for the soft, familiar clatter of pans coming from below. Mrs. Caldwell was already at the stove, tying on her apron. She looked up with mild surprise. "Well now," she said with a small laugh. "Most guests tend to sleep in a little longer." "I have always kept early hours," Abigail replied. "May I be of some help?" The older woman looked at her for a moment with the measuring eye of someone who has seen many promises made and few kept. Then she nodded toward the flour bin. "If you can make a decent biscuit, I am not going to turn that down." Abigail rolled up her sleeves. Within a few minutes, her hands were moving through the motions she had known since childhood. Measuring, mixing, cutting, shaping. The simple rhythm of it settled her nerves almost immediately. By the time the first good smell of baking bread had spread through the kitchen, the bacon was sizzling in the pan and coffee was bubbling on the back of the stove. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway just as Abigail slid the biscuit pan into the oven. He stopped. His gray eyes moved across the kitchen slowly, taking in the activity, the smells, the tidiness of it all. "Morning," Abigail said, not slowing down in the least. He gave a single nod. "Morning, Mrs." Caldwell poured him a cup of coffee, threw a quiet wink in Abigail's direction, and made herself scarce. Nathaniel pulled out a chair and sat down. He said nothing for a while. He simply watched her work. No wasted steps, no unnecessary movements. Everything done cleanly and with purpose. After a time, she set a plate in front of him. Eggs, bacon, and a golden biscuit still breathing steam from the oven. "You made this?" he asked. "I told you I could cook," she said. He took a bite and was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "That is the best meal I have sat down to in months." The other travelers drifted in one by one not long after, pleasantly surprised to find a full breakfast laid out and waiting. Abigail poured coffee and passed plates until every chair was full. Only when the last person was served did she fill a plate for herself and take a seat across from Nathaniel. He watched her with a thoughtful expression. "The ranch house has not had a woman in it since I bought the place," he said quietly. "The garden has gone completely wild. The kitchen is barely worth the name." Abigail waited and let him finish. "I would like to offer you a trial," he continued. She looked up. "1 month," Nathaniel said. "You come out to the ranch, help put the house back in order, see whether the life is something you can live with." "And if I can?" she asked. "Then at the end of the month, we decide. Together." Abigail turned it over carefully in her mind. "More than fair," she said at last, and gave a small, deliberate nod. "I accept." Nathaniel finished the last of his coffee and pushed back his chair. "We should leave within the hour. It is 40 miles to the ranch." Abigail folded her napkin, set it beside her plate, and stood. Outside, the morning sun was beginning to climb into the wide Wyoming sky. Nathaniel lifted her carpet bag up onto the wagon seat. As Abigail pulled herself up beside him, something stirred quietly in her chest. It was not quite fear and not quite hope. It was the feeling of a door swinging open onto a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. And the road ahead would settle everything. The road to the ranch stretched across the open land like a thin ribbon of pale dust pressed into the earth. Nathaniel drove the wagon at an easy, steady pace, the horses moving comfortably beneath a wide Wyoming sky. Abigail sat beside him with her carpet bag resting across her lap, the wind pulling gently at the edge of her bonnet. For several miles they traveled without a word between them, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The land felt different here from Nebraska, wilder, more lonesome. Low hills rolled away in every direction, blanketed in tough grass and gray-green sagebrush. Somewhere far ahead, the mountains hung pale blue and distant against the horizon, as though painted there by a steady, unhurried hand. Nathaniel lifted the reins slightly and pointed. "That ridge over there is called Lone Pine," he said. "My eastern fence line follows the creek that runs below it." Abigail studied the land with careful attention. "You manage all of this by yourself?" "Mostly." "How many acres?" 2,000. Abigail said nothing, but the number settled over her quietly. That was more land than her father had ever come close to owning. Nathaniel spoke again after a moment. "I run about 200 head of cattle, and some horses as well. Do you have any help?" "I bring on a hand during branding season and the drives," he replied. He paused. "Got one on right now, actually. Young fellow by the name of Daniel Cooper. Good, reliable worker." Almost as if the land itself had been listening for the name, a rider appeared far up the trail ahead of them, coming toward them at a full gallop and kicking up a long line of dust. When he drew close enough, he pulled his horse to a sliding stop and tipped his hat with an easy, unhurried grin. "Well, I'll be," the young man said. "You made it back sooner than I figured, Sam." Nathaniel brought the wagon to a halt. "Daniel," he said, "this is Miss Abigail Turner. She will be staying out at the ranch for a stretch." Daniel Cooper's friendly eyes went wide with something between surprise and delight. "Ma'am," he said quickly, pulling off his hat, "welcome to the Double W." Abigail smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Just Daniel," he said with easy confidence. He turned his horse and fell in alongside the wagon as they rolled on, talking freely and without much pause about spring calves, a stretch of broken fence on the north side, and the deeply unpredictable nature of Wyoming weather. Abigail noticed the contrast between them almost immediately. Daniel was lively and talkative, the kind of young man who fills every silence with stories and laughter and never seems to run short of either. Nathaniel beside her offered almost nothing in return, but she could feel the way his attention sharpened and tightened each time Daniel directed a comment or a grin in her direction. The ranch buildings came into view before long, settled on a low rise above a narrow creek. The house itself was solid and well-made, built from dark timber and stone, and it had the look of something put together to last. But the yard around it told a different story. The garden fence leaned at a defeated angle. Weeds had taken everything over. Dust lay thick across the porch rails like a second skin. Abigail climbed down from the wagon and took a long, careful look around her. She did not say it out loud, but she was already beginning to take an inventory. "The bones are good," Nathaniel said quietly, as though he had read her expression. "Strong walls, deep porch, solid windows." "Yes," Abigail agreed. "It needs work." Daniel had already hopped down from his horse and was leaning against the fence with his arms crossed. "More than just work, if we are being honest. That kitchen has been a war zone for the better part of a year." Nathaniel did not dignify that with a response. He carried Abigail's bag inside and showed her up the narrow staircase to a small bedroom at the back of the house, with a window that looked out over the creek below. "This will be yours," he said. "For now," she replied. He nodded once and stepped back toward the door. She set down her bag, turned around, and smoothed her sleeves. "I will start with the kitchen." Nathaniel raised one eyebrow. "You only just arrived." Abigail rolled up her sleeves with calm, deliberate purpose. "And the house just met the woman who was going to put it right." For the first time since she had arrived in Wyoming, Nathaniel Walker laughed. By the end of the first week, the ranch house no longer looked like a place that had given up on itself. Abigail was up before first light every morning, feeding the stove while the sky outside was still a deep, unbroken black. By the time Nathaniel and Daniel came in from their first check of the cattle, the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread had already settled through the house like something that had always belonged there. The dust was gone from the floors. The windows had been cleaned until they let the light in properly again. The long wooden table no longer carried the weight of weeks of accumulated grime. Even the front porch had been swept down to bare, clean boards. Nathaniel noticed every change. He made no particular comment about any of it. Daniel, however, had no such restraint. "You are an absolute miracle worker, Miss Abigail," he announced one afternoon while hauling water buckets in from the well. Abigail glanced up from her work. "It is only cleaning." Daniel shook his head with theatrical conviction. "No, ma'am, it is more than that. Before you arrived, Sam was surviving on beans and whatever he managed not to completely burn. Nathaniel, who happened to be passing through the doorway at that precise moment, fixed him with a flat look." Daniel adjusted his statement quickly. "Well, mostly burnt." Abigail turned back to what she was doing so that neither of them could see her face. Over the days that followed, the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. The men were out on the range from sunup until late in the afternoon. Abigail kept the house, cooked the meals, and gradually began working on the neglected garden plot behind the kitchen, pulling weeds, straightening the fence, turning over soil that had gone hard and dry. In the evenings they gathered at the table. Daniel filled whatever silence presented itself with stories of runaway calves, half-collapsed fence posts, and the general unpredictability of life on the Wyoming range. Nathaniel mostly listened, though Abigail had begun to notice something. Whenever Daniel laughed a little too loudly or leaned in a little too close when he spoke to her, something in the set of Nathaniel's shoulders went fractionally tighter. Toward the end of the first week, a rider appeared at the gate. A woman in her mid-50s, wind-burned and confident in the saddle, who came straight into the yard without slowing down or waiting to be invited. "Well now," she called out cheerfully. "Looks like Sam Walker has finally gone and gotten himself a woman." Nathaniel stepped out onto the porch. "Mrs. Hartley." The woman swung down from her horse with practiced ease and tied it to the rail. "Elizabeth Hartley," she said to Abigail, offering a firm, no-nonsense handshake. 8 Mile Ranch. Nearest neighbor you have got." "Abigail Turner," Abigail said warmly. Elizabeth gave her a long, unhurried look and then gave a single approving nod. "You have the look of someone who knows which end of a broom to use." They sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Elizabeth shared everything worth knowing about the surrounding country, which merchants in Cheyenne could be trusted, and which could not, which roads turned to rivers during a heavy storm, which winters had hit the cattle hard. After a while, her gaze drifted toward the window, where Daniel was out repairing the leaning gate post. "That young man seems rather taken with you," she said, casually enough to be dangerous. Abigail glanced outside. Daniel chose that exact moment to look up and give her a cheerful wave. "He is kind," Abigail said. Elizabeth gave a small, dry snort. "Kind is a fine quality. Does not always mean it is the right fit, though." Her eyes slid over toward Nathaniel, who was seated nearby working on a broken saddle strap with quiet, methodical attention. "That is the man you want to be paying attention to," she added, lowering her voice just slightly. Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Why is that?" Elizabeth smiled in the particular way of someone who has watched enough of life to know the answer before the question is finished. "Because Sam Walker has been alone long enough." A slow pause. "And a lonely man who suddenly finds himself not lonely anymore." Her eyes carried a warm, knowing gleam. "That is something worth noticing." Outside, the wind moved in long, slow passes through the tall grass. Nathaniel glanced up toward the kitchen window without appearing to mean to. For just a moment, his gray eyes found Abigail's. Then he looked back down at the saddle strap. The second week on the ranch brought rain with it. It arrived gently at first, tapping at the windows while slow gray clouds drifted in from the direction of the mountains. The dry ground soaked it up eagerly, and the air turned cool and clean with the smell of wet earth and sage. For a while it felt like a mercy after the dry weeks that had preceded it, but by afternoon the rain had changed its character entirely. It came down in earnest now, heavy and unrelenting, and the creek behind the ranch house began to swell in response. The quiet trickle that had run along the lower pasture was thickening fast into something louder and more purposeful. Nathaniel stood on the porch and watched the darkening sky with his jaw set. "Water is coming up faster than it ought to," he said quietly. Daniel rode in from the north pasture at a hard gallop, his horse dark and slick with rain, and pulled up short at the yard gate. "Sam!" he shouted, jumping from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. "The creek has already gone over the lower bank." Nathaniel did not waste time. "Get the cattle moved to higher ground," he said. "Right now." Daniel turned back to his horse without a word and rode off immediately. Abigail stepped out onto the porch beside Nathaniel. The rain soaked through her sleeves within seconds. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Get the supplies upstairs, just in case." She did not wait for him to explain further. Within a few minutes she was hauling sacks of flour, canned goods, and water jugs up to the second floor of the house, while the storm roared louder outside and thunder rolled in long, low waves across the valley. Then, cutting straight through the noise of the wind and the rain, a sharp and plaintive cry reached her from somewhere near the creek. A calf. More than one. Nathaniel heard it too and was already moving off the porch at a run. Abigail ran with him. What she saw when they reached the water stopped her cold. 3 young calves were stranded on a rapidly shrinking island of mud in the middle of the creek, and the water around them was roaring past with a force that made the ground tremble underfoot. Daniel had ridden up behind them and was already holding a coil of rope with both hands. "It is too dangerous!" he shouted over the storm. Nathaniel did not answer. He looped one end of the rope around his own waist and handed Daniel the other. Hold on and do not let go." Before anyone could say another word, he stepped into the rushing water. The current hit him with a force that nearly took his legs out from under him. Abigail stood at the bank with her heart hammering in her throat and watched him fight his way toward the frightened calves. One of them slipped suddenly, caught by the current, and swept sideways. Nathaniel lunged and caught it, but the water dragged them both downstream in a long, struggling arc. "Sam!" Daniel shouted, throwing his whole weight against the rope. Without allowing herself a single second to think about it, Abigail grabbed the second rope. She wrapped it quickly around her own waist and turned to Daniel. "Hold this," she said. And then she stepped into the creek. The cold water hit her like a wall of ice. The current grabbed at her skirts and pulled with the blind, impersonal strength of moving water. But Abigail drove herself forward against it until she reached Nathaniel. Together they turned the struggling calf toward the bank. Daniel hauled on the rope with everything he had. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they fought their way back through the current until the calf scrambled up onto solid mud and stood trembling and safe. 2 more were still out there on that shrinking island. Nathaniel caught his breath in ragged gulps. "We are going back," he said. Daniel shook his head with something close to desperation. "No, absolutely not." But Abigail was already tightening the rope again. She stepped back into the water beside Nathaniel, shoulder to shoulder, and they pushed together into the current while the storm raged around them and the creek fought to pull them under. And somewhere in the middle of that cold, roaring struggle, something changed in Nathaniel Walker's understanding of the woman beside him. He had known brave people in his life. He had never known anyone quite like this. By the time they pulled the last calf up onto the muddy bank, the storm was in full, howling command of the valley. Abigail sank down onto the wet grass, coughing hard, every muscle in her body shaking from the effort of fighting the current for so long. Her dress was soaked through completely, heavy with icy water, and her ribs ached with a deep, grinding sharpness each time she tried to draw a full breath. Beside her, Nathaniel dropped to his knees in the mud without any ceremony at all. For a moment he said nothing. Then his hands moved over her shoulders and arms with quick, careful attention. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though the movement cost her. "The calves," she managed. Daniel looked down at the 3 small, shivering animals standing together on the bank. "All 3 safe," he said. He looked between the 2 of them and shook his head slowly. "I want to be clear that the pair of you are considerably crazier than a spring tornado." Nathaniel let out a long, unsteady breath. Then his hand came up and touched Abigail's face, his thumb brushing a streak of mud from her cheek. "That was the most reckless thing I have ever witnessed," he said. Abigail managed a faint, exhausted smile. "You went in first? That is different." "How is it different?" He looked straight at her. "Because I can afford to lose myself." Something in Abigail's chest tightened around those words. Without thinking, she reached up and grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet but entirely without doubt. "You are not expendable. Not to this ranch. Not to anyone here." Nathaniel stared at her. Something that had been closed off and guarded for a very long time shifted in his expression, like a door being opened from the inside. Daniel cleared his throat with the well-practiced loudness of a man making absolutely sure he was heard. "I believe we should seriously consider getting inside before the entire lower valley goes underwater." Nathaniel got to his feet and lifted Abigail up with steady hands, supporting her carefully when a sharp wince crossed her face. Together, and with Daniel trailing behind, muttering quiet prayers under his breath, they made their way back through the rain to the house. Inside, the fire in the stove had kept the kitchen warm, while outside the storm battered the walls and threw itself against the windows. Abigail changed into dry clothes, while Nathaniel and Daniel made another round through the rain to secure the barn and bring the chickens to safety. The storm kept at it for hours. Water poured across the lower pasture in broad, shallow sheets and carried debris past the house in dark, swirling lines. But the buildings held their ground, and the cattle were safe on higher land. By evening, the storm had finally begun to exhaust itself, and a pale, washed-out sunset crept across the valley. Abigail was standing carefully at the stove, working through the motions of making supper and trying not to favor her left side too obviously, when Nathaniel came into the kitchen. "Let me see your ribs," he said. She hesitated for only a moment, then lifted the edge of her shirt. A wide spread of dark purple bruising had settled across her side where the calf had kicked her during the rescue. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. His fingers moved across the bruised skin with surprising gentleness. "I am sorry," he said. "For what?" "For being someone you felt you had to risk your life over." Abigail turned to face him. "I did not do it because I had to." He frowned slightly. "Then why?" She held his gaze without any wavering at all. "Because you matter." The words settled in the quiet kitchen and stayed there. Neither of them moved. Then Nathaniel stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, not with urgency or desperation, but with the slow, deep, aching grip of a man who has been without this for far too long. Outside, the last of the storm let go in a gentle, diminishing rain across the valley, and inside the ranch house, something that had not existed before, quietly began. The storm left the land behind it changed in ways both visible and not. For days afterward, the creek ran wide and brown and fast, carrying fence posts and broken branches downstream in lazy, turning circles. The lower pasture had turned to boot-sucking mud, and the garden fence had gone over entirely, but the ranch itself was standing, and the people in it were still on their feet. The next morning, Nathaniel and Daniel rode out at first light to count and check the herd. Abigail moved carefully through the kitchen, her ribs still loud with complaint at certain angles, but she did not let that slow her down in any way that mattered. There was work to be done, and the ranch did not pause for personal comfort. When the men rode back in around midday, their horses were caked with mud up to the knee. "The herd is fine," Daniel reported. "We lost a stretch of fence line on the north side, though. Maybe half a mile of it, maybe more." Nathaniel nodded. "We start on it tomorrow." They sat down to the midday meal, and the quality of the quiet between Nathaniel and Abigail had shifted in a way that was hard to name but impossible to miss. Something warmer, something more settled. Daniel noticed it with the particular alertness of a young man who pays more attention than he usually lets on. His usual easy stream of conversation trailed off as he watched them across the table. Eventually, he pushed his chair back and reached for his hat. "I think I should go have a look at the barn," he said. The door closed behind him with a small, definitive click. Nathaniel looked down at his plate for a long, quiet moment. Then he spoke. "Reverend Harper comes through Cheyenne on the first Saturday of every month." Abigail raised her eyes. "If you are certain," Nathaniel said, "he could marry us." The words were plain and simple, but everything behind them was not. Abigail studied his face with care. "You are asking me to stay. I am asking whether you want to," he said. She leaned back slightly in her chair. "Even before the trial month is finished?" He gave a slow nod. "I have seen enough." Abigail folded her hands together on the table and was quiet for a moment. "There is something you should know first," she said. His expression tightened just slightly. "What is it?" "My sister may not always feel the way she does today." Abigail said it plainly and without drama. "People change their minds. She may someday decide she made a mistake. She may come looking for the life she chose to give away." Nathaniel's answer did not require even a moment of consideration. "I did not choose your sister." Abigail's breath slowed. "You chose me." He stood and came around the table until he was standing beside her chair. He rested his hand on her shoulder, rough and warm and steady. "I chose the woman who told me the truth when she had every reason in the world to hide it." His voice dropped, quieter now. "I chose the woman who put my house back in order, saved my calves in a flood, and stepped into a raging creek without a second's hesitation. I chose the woman who made this place feel like a home worth coming back to." Abigail looked up at him. "And if I say yes, then we begin building the rest of our lives together." His gray eyes held hers, and they were completely certain. Abigail was quiet for a moment longer. Then she rose slowly, ignoring the protest in her ribs, and stood before him. "I crossed half a continent to bring you the truth," she said. "I am still offering it." She placed her hand over his. "Yes." Outside, the Wyoming wind moved long and easy through the tall grass, and inside the ranch house, two people who had each believed they were someone else's second choice, finally, quietly, chose each other first. The drought came 6 weeks after the wedding, arriving without announcement the way the worst things often do. At first, it read like nothing more than the ordinary dry heat of a Wyoming summer, and the ranchers who watched the sky and read the land were patient with it, as they had learned to be. But week after week went by without rain. The creek shrank to a thin, uncertain thread winding through the pasture. The grass turned stiff and pale under the relentless sun. The cattle began to show their ribs. One evening, Abigail stood with Nathaniel on the porch and watched a thin veil of dust drift across the fields in the last light. "We're going to have to sell off some of the herd," he said quietly. "How many head?" she asked. "Half," he said. "Possibly more." Abigail nodded. It was not a decision that sat easy with either of them. Those cattle were the backbone of the ranch, but keeping animals alive on land that could no longer feed them was not mercy. It was prolonged loss. A few days later, they drove 30 head into Cheyenne, with Daniel riding along to help push the cattle through the stockyard gates. The yards were crowded that morning, full of other ranchers facing the same hard arithmetic. A lean buyer with sharp eyes walked the pen, looked the cattle over without haste, and shook his head. $15 a head, he said. Nathaniel's jaw went tight. "In a decent year, they are worth 40. The man lifted one shoulder. "This is not a decent year. You can take what I'm offering or load them back up and haul them home." Nathaniel stood with it for a moment, then nodded. They needed the money, and there was no point pretending otherwise. As the buyer counted out the bills, Abigail became aware of voices from the direction of the next pen. Two well-dressed women stood watching them from a short distance away, with the particular ease of people who believe they are not being overheard. "Well," one of them said, just barely below conversational volume, "that must be Sam Walker's wife over there." The other gave a small, amused laugh. "The replacement sister." Abigail kept her eyes forward and her expression steady, but the words landed exactly where they were aimed. "I heard he was expecting the pretty one," the first woman went on. "The poor man must have been terribly let down." Nathaniel went completely still beside her. Then slowly and deliberately, he turned to face them. "Ladies," he said. His voice was calm and even, and carried across the yard without any effort at all. Both women startled when they realized he had been listening the whole time. "Mr. Walker," one of them said quickly, "we did not mean any harm." Nathaniel took one unhurried step in their direction. "I would like to explain something to you," he said. "I could have had my pick of any number of pretty women who would have been undone by their first hard winter in this country." The two women exchanged a glance that carried a great deal of discomfort. Instead, he continued, "I married a woman who outworks every man I have ever hired." He did not gesture toward Abigail so much as simply acknowledge her presence, as someone who required no ceremony to be recognized. "My wife rebuilt this house from the floors up, saved my cattle in a flood, and has stood beside me every single day through a drought that would have broken a lesser person." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "She is worth more than every shallow word I have heard whispered in this town." The women offered nothing in response. Nathaniel turned away from them, took Abigail's hand, and began walking toward the wagon. Daniel fell into step behind them, wearing the expression of a man doing his absolute best not to grin too visibly. "Never known you to string that many words together at one time, Sam," he remarked. Nathaniel gave a short, non-committal shrug. "A man defends what is his." That night, lying beside him in the quiet of the ranch house, Abigail traced slow circles across his chest in the dark. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. "You did not owe me that." Nathaniel caught her hand gently and held it still. "Yes," he said. "I did." The rain came at dawn. At first it was only a faint, tentative sound against the bedroom window, light enough that Abigail half heard it in her sleep and thought for a moment it was nothing more than the wind brushing the glass. Then Nathaniel sat up beside her. "Abby," he said quietly. She opened her eyes. "What is it?" He was already on his feet, moving toward the window. "Listen." The soft, uncertain tapping grew steadier, then steadier still. Real, even, unhurried rain. Abigail was out of bed and on the porch with him within a minute, a shawl thrown around her shoulders, standing in the dark while water fell in long silver lines across the fields. After months of cracked earth and dust and hot, dry wind, the smell of it was almost impossible to believe. Nathaniel let out a slow, deep breath. Thank God. Down at the bunkhouse, Daniel burst out the door with his hat in his hand and his face tilted up toward the sky, laughing the way a person laughs when relief is bigger than words. "It is actually raining!" he shouted at no one and everyone. Out in the pasture, the cattle stood with their heads lifted, still and patient, letting the water come down over them. The thirsty ground drank every drop without wasting a moment. Within hours, the dry creek had found its voice again. The dust settled. The stiff, pale grass began to lift and breathe. By evening, the ranch felt like itself again. Abigail was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, when a wave of dizziness moved through her without warning. She gripped the edge of the table and waited for it to pass. Nathaniel was at her side immediately. "Are you all right?" She straightened up slowly. Her hand had moved, without quite meaning to rest against her stomach. "I think I would like to see the doctor in town tomorrow," she said. Concern moved across his face. "Are you ill?" She looked at him with a small, quiet smile. "Not exactly." The doctor told them the following morning, in a comfortable office on Cheyenne's main street. "Late winter, I would estimate," he said, with the settled warmth of someone delivering news he enjoys delivering. "You are going to have a baby, Mrs. Walker." Nathaniel stood in the doorway of that office for a moment without moving. Then he crossed the room and pulled Abigail into his arms right there on the street, where anyone passing might see them. "We are going to be parents," he said. The words came out slightly stunned, as though he was still working out whether they were real. "We are," she said. That night they sat together on the porch while the stars came out one by one over the quiet valley. Nathaniel rested his hand gently over her stomach and said nothing for a long time. "I never let myself imagine having this," he said at last. "A home with someone in it. A family." Abigail leaned into him. "Neither did I." A few weeks later, on a quiet evening under a full moon that turned everything silver and still, Nathaniel led her to the young cottonwood tree they had planted together near the house in the weeks after the flood. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a bundle of old letters. She recognized them at once, the letters he had written to the woman he had believed was coming west to marry him, the letters he had written before he knew her name. Without a word, he knelt down and dug a small hollow in the earth beneath the tree and set the letters into it. "What are you doing?" Abigail asked softly. "Letting the past rest where it belongs," he said. He pressed the soil back into place with both hands. "We do not need those anymore." Abigail slipped her hand into his. "No," she said. "We have something better." The wind moved gently through the cottonwood above them. Two people who had each arrived at this place believing themselves to be someone else's second choice stood together in the moonlight, building a life that belonged entirely and only to them. And every morning that followed, without fanfare or ceremony, they chose each other again.